Let's continue simplifying our code, and in this lesson, we're gonna simplify the process of activity selection for every TimelineItem object. And the way it's gonna be done is basically by assigning selected activity ID to activity ID property of the particular TimelineItem object. So in terms of code, it looks like this. From within TimelineItem component, we have the listener registered for the select event on the base select component. And as a handler for this listener, we use selectActivity function, which is basically going to fire a custom event called selectActivity to the parent component. And also this event will contain activity object that we have just selected. And from within the parent component, the timeline, will listen for the selectActivity event and fire another custom event called setTimelineItemActivity to root component. But in this case, we're passing two pieces of data. First one is the TimelineItem object, for which we're about to update activity. And as a third argument in here, we're using that activity object that we have received as part of selectActivity event from the TimelineItem component. And finally, we handle this event inside of the root component by using setTimelineItemActivity function, which is basically going to assign activity ID to the activity ID property of TimelineItem object. As we can see, there is nothing special about this function, but the fact that we have to listen for a bunch of custom events just to get a signal from one of the descendant components to update activity for some TimelineItem object is quite a lot of work. So to avoid all those event listeners, we can simply provide access to this function by using provide function call, as we were doing before. So we're gonna add one more provide function call. This time we're gonna use setTimelineItemActivity as a key and provide the reference to this function as a second argument, like so. And after this, we can easily get a reference to this function by using inject function call from within TimelineItem component, like so. So now we're gonna call this function directly once we receive select event from base select component. And this will happen when new option will be selected. But we also have to provide a couple more parameters to this function. First one will be the TimelineItem object for which we're about to assign new activity, and the second argument will be activity ID, which is stored within special event variable, because that select event, which is received from base select component, includes activity ID as a payload, which we can access in here by using special event variable. So now we're calling this function defined within the app component directly when we select new activity by using the select box. And as a result, we no longer need to register custom event select activity inside of TimelineItem component. So let's remove this line within defining its macro. Let's also scroll up a little bit and remove import of unused function is activity valid. And this way, select activity function becomes unused, as we can see, which is why we can easily remove this function as well, along with another function used inside of this function, find activity by ID. So we're gonna remove both of these functions. And after doing all that, we can see that activities array is no longer used as well inside of this component. So let's go ahead and remove this constant activities, then going back to the root component. And from here we can also remove event registration for setTimelineItemActivity event. Because we are assigning particular activity ID to TimelineItem object directly within TimelineItem component when we receive select event after selecting particular activity, we're calling directly function setTimelineItemActivity, which is defined within the root component. But we were able to get access to this function from TimelineItem component by using provide inject technique. And also when we're calling this function, it's really important to provide all necessary arguments, because as a first argument this function expects TimelineItem object, and as a second argument it expects activity object that we are about to assign to the TimelineItem object. But this time we're not passing the whole activity object, but only activity ID, so let's rename this parameter on activity ID. And now in the browser, let's check it out. We're gonna try to select activity by using the select box and make sure that no errors happen after we do so. So everything seems to be fine. Now let's go back to the editor. And by the way, we even no longer have to use that nullable activity object that we were using before when we were resetting the value of the activity select box. Because this time whenever we reset value of the select box, second parameter activity ID we'll get value null. And this value we're gonna assign directly to activity ID property of the TimelineItem object. And everything will be working fine. So let's go ahead and switch over to the constants module, find that nullable activity constant, and remove this declaration. And now let's just do a little moving around of some constants, specifically those constants responsible for the page names, and move all these constants to the top of this file, like so, for a better grouping of related constants. And at the end of this lesson, let's also remove a couple more event listeners that we no longer need, such as select activity inside of the timeline component. Let's remove this line, and along with that we can easily remove validation function for that event. So we can completely remove usage of define emits macro, since there is only one event registered in here, which we no longer fire from this component. And now let's scroll up to the beginning of this file and remove a couple more unused imports. And there is also one more unused import within TimelineItem component. That is this nullable activity constant. Since we have already removed this constant before, therefore we don't need this import. So one more time, let's make sure that when we select activity by using this select box, we don't get any errors. And also when we reset the value. So everything seems to be working fine. And finally, let's go inside of app component, and right here, when we were providing access to activities array, since we no longer have to receive access to this array from any descendant components, we don't need to provide it in here, so we can easily remove this line. And at this, we're gonna finish this lesson.